Spring is almost here, and with it comes questions about the cattle markets and how they'll impact beef producers. Joining us now to share his insights on this important issue is Kevin Good with CattleFax. Kevin, last year this time it was incredibly wet. We had all the snowstorms and getting a little concerned about planting. It certainly had some impacts on the grain markets this last year. What do we see as we move into planting this year?
Well, I'll tell you what, it looks like we're changing weather patterns. Dr. Art Douglas, who does our forecasting, would suggest that we are moving into a La Nina weather pattern.
Yep.
And that said, that would suggest as you go through the spring planting that it'll be almost ideal conditions for the Corn Belt. You know, unlike last year where it was extremely wet, he would suggest we'll have normal plantings. The USDA came out last week suggesting we'd have a increase in acres planted as far as the surveys that they've done so far. So as you think about that component of cost to produce cattle, it looks like we'll get a little bit of relief as we go through 2020.
Gotcha. You know, since convention, we've sure seen some volatility in these markets. What's driving that?
Well, the trigger point was coronavirus, and really it started to affect the cattle futures about 10 days before the convention. But since then, you know, we've had an additional drop of about $7 to $8 on the futures. And the live market has gone from 124 the first few weeks of January to this week, the last week in February, we've sold live cattle at 115. So unfortunately, you know, once the coronavirus kind of hit the headlines, a lot of the funds that participate in ag commodities, cattle in this case, wanted to sell their way out of their long position, and therefore we had quite a bit of a drop. This particular week, now you're starting to see the coronavirus influence the financials, and the stock market has had about an 8% correction through yesterday, through Tuesday of this week, and so that we're seeing some additional spillover pressure out of that.
So let's talk about trade. I mean, what is this volatility and uncertainty going to mean in terms of our trade prospects in the year ahead?
Yeah, it's unfortunate because what we're hearing coming out of China in particular with the coronavirus is they are having trouble from a labor standpoint getting ships and containers unloaded. So if we look at some of the data that we see so far, pork numbers look very good. They are importing a lot of pork through the end of 19 and so far in 2020. Poultry side, a little bit disappointing, and globally poultry prices are pretty low. And then when we look at the beef side, we're not getting a lot of traction into China, but we are getting additional traction into Japan with a new trade agreement there. That's very encouraging.
Yeah. You know, it's always a supply and demand market in addition to all these other factors, but let's talk supply. What does the overall protein supply look like, and what are we looking to in terms of production of beef in the U.S. this next year?
You know, as we think about it year to date, production has been larger than we would have forecast. We were looking for larger supplies all the way across the board, and we've seen that plus a little bit. If we start with beef production through the first 2 months of the year has been up 4%. It's a combination of aggressive harvest levels as well as heavier carcass weights, especially compared to last year when we had the weather influenced lighter weights. On pork and poultry, both of those numbers are up 6 to 7% year to date. So that's a huge increase year over year from our production standpoint. We would still stand by when this year is all said and done. Beef production is going to be up about 2%. We think pork will be up about 2.5% to 3%, and broiler production up about 4%. So we still got a headwind as we go through 2020, although we do think that we'll see improvement in trade to offset partially some of that increased production.
So we've got a mountain of meat to eat our way through.
Well, we've got a pile anyway.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that is kind of the headwinds that we face in the cattle market today.
Yeah. So let's talk 2020. I mean, what does all this mean in terms of cattle prices for our beef producers over the next year?
You know, as we think about the seasonal look of the market, it's going to be different this year in pertaining to fed cattle. And unfortunately, with the bigger production levels, with the fact that you've had the coronavirus that's influenced the futures, instead of putting your highs in the spring, it looks like we're heading closer to our lows. So it's going to be a untypical or a contra-seasonal type looking at fed cattle. And with that said, we're probably going to have to struggle here for the next couple of months looking at the fed market. In those type of years, Kevin, typically you have a very sharp, strong rally through the second half of the year. And you actually put your highs in the latter part of the year in the fourth quarter. So even though short term, we've got some tough rows to hoe,
Sure.
Longer term, it still looks better for 2020. You look at the other classes of cattle, yearling types in particular, they've been trading between 140 and 145 really for the last 30 days, basis of plains. They could get a little bit softer for a minute in here, but generally speaking, they'll trend stronger through the summer into their typical highs, late summer, early fall. The calf market, they probably will be the least affected short term. Sure. We're going against summer turnout grass, so sure, they're trending higher and they'll stay pretty stout going into the spring. And longer term, we feel like when the year's all said and done, we'll get along better this fall in the calf market than we did a year ago.
That's good news for some of our cow-calf producers, but again, great example of how quickly global issues can impact markets right here at home and just the sheer volatility that we have in this industry.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Now, for more than 5 decades, CattleFax has been providing producers with the tools they need to make profitable decisions. If you're looking for top-notch beef industry research, information, and analysis, visit the website CattleFax.com.